Hi and welcome to video 3 of week 2 of intermediate course for online Spanish. Today we're going to be talking about reflexive verbs. We've already talked about direct and indirect objects last time. You had to watch that slightly longer video, 20 minutes, but at least it wasn't me talking. And we discussed direct and indirect objects. I know the video was a little bit more complex, but again, basically getting down to the root of it, we were just learning how to say I have this versus I have the door, or I have the key. I have this or I have it. Learning how to say I have them when it's books or things like that. So you've learned how to use a verb and how to attach something to shorten it, and that even works for giving it to somebody else. I gave it to them, referring to the book. I gave the book to Maria and Frank. I gave it to them. And we used the lo's and the la's and the may's and the tays and all that stuff to talk about how to do this indirect direct object pronouns. Reflexive verbs are kind of related to that in that they have that little 2-3 letter piece that you have to add to it in order to make it usable. And the thing is, with the reflexive verb, we're talking about a verb and the direct object turns into itself. Okay, so for example, if I say I washed the dog, I'm the one performing the action. I'm washing the dog, which is receiving the action. If I say I wash myself, all of a sudden the action is reflecting back onto the same person or thing that's doing the action, is the same thing that's receiving the action, and that's when it turns into reflexive. So I wash myself. I buy something for myself. Anything like that, when it's coming back on itself, all of a sudden it turns into reflexive. Now, you could explain the rules, you could look over and kind of try to understand exactly what it is, but there's a feeling behind reflexive that gets used. And that's really what we're going to try to focus on instead of learning all the ins and outs and all the rules of when it gets used. We're going to learn how to use it, like how to actually technically use it, writing it down, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the theory behind it. So, first of all, let's look at the conjugations and how they get handled. Okay, so if you have the sheet out, you work your way down about halfway. We have it broken down. It says the following table shows a reflexive verb given in all of its present tense conjugations. Okay, and we're working off the verb bañarse, which means to bathe oneself. So the unconjugated infinitive form of a reflexive verb is usually has the verb with an se at the end. Bañarse, cepillarse. There's a big list of them right below that. When you conjugate it, you take off the se, and then you have to conjugate the verb itself in normal present tense, just like you would as if it was a regular verb. And then with that se, you throw a changed version of it on the front. So for example, yo me baño, I bathe myself. You're taking bañar, which means to bathe. You're conjugating it to baño, and then you're taking the me, or the se, you're taking the se, throwing it on the front and changing it to a me because the subject is me or I. Tú te bañas, same thing. Él, ella se baña, usted se baña, nosotros nos bañamos, ellos, ellas se bañan, ustedes se bañan. So if it's an I, you're going to put a me in front. If it's a tú, you're going to put a te in front. If it's an él, ella, usted, ellos, ellas, ustedes, you just throw an se in front, the se, leave it as it is. And then if there's a nosotros in front, you just throw a nos. So that's how we technically use reflexive. Now the theory behind it. I have a list of verbs here, and I'm going to go down this list, and I thought instead of sitting here and trying to explain what it is, I'm going to go through some of these verbs, and I'm going to explain to you what the meaning is using it as reflexive in English. I figured that would make it a little bit simpler. So I will just go down the verb list. So think, just kind of relax, open your mind and think, okay, this reflexive verb means this, so what's the feeling behind it? So the first one, casarse. Casarse means to get married. Casar by itself would just be to marry. But because the action comes back on itself indirectly, in English we use the word get, but there's no one specifically performing the action, it's just kind of this passive action that's happening. They use reflexive in situations like that. So I got stuck, I got married, I got sick, which we'll see in a minute. Or I get sick, or we get sick, we get married. Reflexive gets used in that. And you would have to take casarse, you would have to use nosotros, because we get married, and then you'd have to conjugate casar to casamos, and then when you take the se, turn it into nos, and put it in the beginning, and it would be nos casamos, we get married. Cansarse, to get tired, same type of feeling. So even though we're talking about the action kind of reflecting back on itself, cansarse, in English we just say I get tired, me canso. Enfermarse, to get sick. Yo me enfermo cada primavera. I get sick every spring. I'm not enfermando a otra persona. I'm not making somebody else sick. I'm getting sick to myself. Now, it doesn't mean I'm physically making myself sick, but I am myself becoming ill, so it's reflexive. Comprarse, to buy one's self. So me compro would be I buy myself. Tú te compras un carro, you buy a car for yourself. Now some of these, for example, comprarse, could be used just as comprar, to buy. And it's just as in English we can say I buy a car, I buy myself a car. Is there any difference? Well, I buy myself a car, I'm specifying who it's for, and just because it happens to be me that's buying it for myself, it all of a sudden becomes reflexive. I could just say compro un carro, I buy a car. It's not specified who it's for. Besarse means to kiss. So me beso could be construed as I kiss myself, but it's also to get kissed, depending on the subject or in the context of the sentence. Burlarse, to make fun of. That means I to myself make fun of somebody else. Me burlo de alguien. It's kind of like I'm laughing to myself about somebody else, even though it's not the word for laugh. Arrodillarse, to kneel down. Okay, again, the action is falling back on itself. You can't just say kneel, because that would be like I kneel somebody else, like I'm making somebody else kneel. I've forced them to be on their knees. Me arrodillo means I put myself on my knees, or I get on my knees. Cortarse, again, if I'm cutting myself or somebody else is cutting themselves, that becomes reflexive. Me corto, I cut myself. Divorciarse, just like to get married, it's just divorce, to get divorced. Emborracharse, to get drunk. Enamorarse, to fall in love or to get in love. Preocuparse is to worry yourself. Okay? So if I just said I worry my mother, you can physically worry somebody else. Me preocupo means I worry myself about something. Quemarse, to get burned, or to burn myself. Quitarse is to remove yourself or remove myself. Rascarse would be to scratch yourself. Reunirse would be to meet, would be to unite with somebody else in a meeting. So me reúno would be I meet myself I meet with somebody else. Secarse, to dry yourself. Sorprenderse, to get surprised or to surprise yourself. Escaparse, to escape yourself, and that doesn't carry over quite as well into English, but that verb does tend to be used in its reflexive form. And so me escapo is I escape myself from something. Cepillarse, to brush myself. Me cepillo, could be the teeth, could be your hair, whatever. Other ones I don't have listed, but one you are going to see on your practice sheet. Lavarse, to wash oneself, specifically with the hands or things like that. So me lavo las manos, I wash to myself the hands. So reflexive, as I said, is just taking a verb, conjugating it normally, but taking the little end piece, the se, which it's not technically the ending of the verb, but it does get attached to it, and you throw it on the beginning, and you have to change it accordingly. Reflexive verbs, the feeling behind it just comes from practice. Again, there's a list of rules you could kind of try to look at as far as when the verb reflects back on itself, but try a little bit with practice and look at some of these verbs specifically. There's other ones. You could Google reflexive verbs in Spanish. Find a few verbs that you could use at work that would make sense. For example, to wash your hands. If you work at a restaurant, you wash your hands every day, I hope. And so think about it. Okay, I wash my hands, me lavo las manos. My boss washes his hands, él se lava las manos. We all wash our hands, nos lavamos las manos. So find a few verbs that in the reflexive that make sense with things that you do on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, and focus on those instead of trying to memorize a list of 20 reflexive verbs and how they get used. Take it to home. Think about what you specifically use and go with that. So there will be one more video for this week. It'll be a shorter video with just probably a few questions about it, just like we had last week. So this will be the last video that I record for you for this week. Best of luck. The worksheet that's attached to this is just basic conjugation of this, just to kind of get you practicing it, and I can see if you're understanding at least the technical portions of it. And we'll work from there. But I hope to see that by next Sunday or Monday, somewhere in there, so that I can get you some feedback by Wednesday or so. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I will see you next week.